giving yourself grace and knowing that there's room for an ADHD brain in motherhood, in your life, in everybody's life is incredibly important.
Just the process of having a kid can be incredibly executive functionally challenging.
Getting my doctorate, if I were to do it all over again, I would do it very differently.
Do you have any recommendations for women navigating this change of becoming a parent?
Oh gosh, yes.
Hello, everyone. Today, I am joined by Anna Burns. Anna has a doctorate in physical therapy and a BA in psychology. She has over a decade of experience as a pelvic health physical therapist, but she decided to start a practice supporting ADHD mums specifically when she was diagnosed with ADHD herself following the birth of her son. And she is coming here to chat to us about parenthood, hormonal shifts, and ADHD. So I'm very, very excited. Welcome, Anna. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here. So thank you so much.
No worries. No worries. So take us through your ADHD diagnosis journey.
Yeah. So I am one of those who was not diagnosed until after the birth of my son in May of 2020. And hindsight obviously is 2020. So I could actually piece all the pieces once I knew from childhood. But yeah, when I had my son, it was during COVID. And so there were so many more layers of executive functioning and planning that needed to happen. And I've been in therapy for years. I've been on antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. I remember telling my therapist, I'm like, I should be feeling better. Like at this point, like I have enough meds in my system, but I feel like I should be feeling better. And it wasn't until after talking to my sister, whose son was diagnosed with ADHD, and then in the process, she got diagnosed with ADHD, that we started having these conversations. And it was like, oh, yeah, no, that's a thing. And she's my half sister who's 11 years older than I am. But we started having these like, oh my gosh, you do that too? Oh, that's what I do too. Oh, wait, that's an ADHD thing. And so I started putting these pieces together because I was having difficulty, not just with the COVID stuff, but like figuring out overstimulation, figuring out how to emotionally regulate, which I didn't know was a thing then, keeping on top of all of my son's appointments and what specialists we needed to see when, and do we already schedule it or do I need to schedule it? I couldn't remember. And so the more I talked to her, the more I was like, oh yeah, no, this is a thing. And so I went to my therapist and said, I really think that this is the problem. And because of insurance reasons in the States, I had a hard time getting medicated for it because here, at least on my health plan, I had to have neuropsych testing to have a stimulant. And so I could not afford that out of pocket because I didn't have that coverage. And so I tried one med non-stimulant for a while and it was like, oh, this is not working. And so finally I found someone who would be willing to do some testing with me that was affordable. And now I've been medicated appropriately since February of this year. And it's made a huge, huge difference.
Wow. Yeah. Gosh, yeah, no, that's quite a journey. And you mentioned that for you, becoming a parent was a big shift for your ADHD. Obviously, your son's diagnosis was a factor, but how did things change for you when you became a parent?
Gosh, everything. So before having my son, I struggled in later school. So like going to get my doctorate in physical therapy was exceedingly difficult in a way that like college was not quite as hard. But I can look back even then and I was tested for other stuff and they're like, oh no, you don't have ADD. And this was like 2000 maybe. So they're like, you don't have it. So I had no idea that was even on my radar. And so once my son was born, I started doing more research, reading more books, talking to more people, and was like, oh, this can happen after childbirth. That it's not necessarily like you get ADHD all of a sudden. It's that you've been coping for so long, and that hormonal shifts can exacerbate symptoms. And I had no idea that that was a thing.
Yeah.
So the more I delved into it, I was like, oh, yeah. And even on hormonal cycles and all this other stuff. So it was like, okay, I'm not the only one here. And the more I started talking to people, it's like, oh, wow. Yeah, no, this is my life's passion for sure.
Definitely. It can definitely be the straw that breaks the camel's back. You can be like managing things and then something about taking care of a tiny human with sleep deprivation.
I was saying I went out on my own to start my own virtual clinic. We bought a house and moved to a town that we weren't familiar with. And I had our son during COVID. So it was like everything that could have possibly happened in that moment. And I really think that if one or two of those things hadn't have happened, I probably would have been trying to compensate longer, honestly.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. What are the biggest changes that you've seen since that time, in terms of actually supporting yourself with ADHD strategies, for example? Have you developed any?
Oh my gosh, yes. One of my daily ones is that often, especially after full days with my son, he's in daycare a few days a week, but I need a nervous system reset. Like in the afternoon, once my husband comes home from work, I'm like, I need 30 minutes. And it's not to sleep. It is just to lay down in my bed with the white noise machine and the lights off and the shades pulled, just to reset. And then I'm a much better person after that. One thing I did was I made a whiteboard in our dining room and put down all the things that were going on in my head, all the to-dos, because I was worrying about and thinking about things for my husband, for me, for my son, shopping lists and everything. And I realized that unless I put it out on paper, I wouldn't remember it, because if it's not in front of me, it's gone.
It's that working memory for sure.
Yep. And also it let my husband know what was going on in my head. And so he could see the to-do list and start being like, oh, well, I can take care of this, or I can take care of this. So even having that small piece, we still use it to this day. And it's been years. It's been super duper helpful, because I will still write on there. I think I wrote on there something yesterday. It was like, oh, I need to remember to actually send this thing. Or when my son goes to occupational therapy, I have a little piece on the whiteboard, which is like, these are the things we need to remember to tell the OT that was great this week, or that we struggled with this week. And I can bring a picture of that to OT and be like, hey, these are the things, because I don't remember.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that makes a lot of sense. I think that, the idea of writing things down. Do you find you have one space? Because I often work with clients and they find that the problem with that system, I mean, it's a great system, but one of the problems is you can end up with like a million different things in a million different spaces.
Yeah. I've got a very large year at a glance calendar behind me to help me plan out like work things with my own business. But I think for me, I just know electronic doesn't work for me. And so if I make an appointment, let's say at a doctor's office, and they send me the text being like, oh, hey, and I add it to my electronic calendar, I just need to remember at the end of the day to go home and write on my paper calendar. So that I can see what's coming ahead. My husband can see what's coming ahead. But if it's not in front of my face, it doesn't happen. So I think I've learned to create that adaptation, just being like, at the end of every day, if I have made an appointment with someone for something somewhere, I need to remember to go back and write it down, because I'm not in my electronic phone, like in my electronic calendar, looking weeks ahead. That just doesn't register with me.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting, because I think we talk a lot about spaces, but we don't talk a lot about paper systems. And I think, there is a lot to be said for paper systems. So can you take me through, you mentioned that it doesn't register for you. So take me through the journey of a task. Say I give you a task right now. I say to you, can you please remember to email me some details after this session? Where does that information go?
I would probably write it down on a Post-it, and I put the Post-it on my phone. So that way, when I go upstairs after this and have my evening, I will remember that's what we talked about.
Interesting.
That's typically what I do. Sometimes I tell people my brain is like a sieve. Can you please just remind me or email me or text me? Sometimes I'll ask for help and just be like, hey, I'm raising my hand. This is my weakness. Not my weakness, but like, this is an area that I need support. Can you help me? But usually I get a lot of Post-its on my phone, or like sometimes in my wallet if I'm trying to remember things to bring somewhere. I'd be like, oh, right. That's what we needed.
Yeah. It's interesting you should bring that second piece up. We've sort of coined it as the catch and release, which is kind of you catch somebody's task and you go, that's great. I'm going to give this back to you.
Yep.
You email me, and then I will email you a response to that.
Exactly. And it's just knowing yourself and owning up to it. And you don't have to like fall on your sword or anything, but just be like, hey, this helps me make me successful in helping you.
Yeah, definitely.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. Now that you've had your son and you've kind of gone through this diagnosis, do you have any recommendations for women navigating this change of becoming a parent?
Oh gosh, yes. So I didn't know that I had ADHD before I had my son, but knowing that adult women are the biggest piece of the pie that are being diagnosed right now is helpful. If you have a diagnosis before you have a kid or get pregnant, just know that everything's going to be a little bit challenged afterwards. And how can you set your systems up that you've already created to be flexible? I think something also that I talk to a lot of people about is if you're already on ADHD medication, that there is something called, at least in the States, a reproductive psychiatrist who knows how what meds you're taking can affect and all that, which I think has been really helpful for a few of my clients who we were working together and all of a sudden they become pregnant and they're like, oh, well, what do I do now? So I think that's been a really helpful thing. I went to one for my depression and anxiety meds. It was super helpful. But I also think on the other side, like after you've had the baby, talk to people. Talk to people about the things you're struggling with. And this isn't like baby blues or postpartum depression, but like, what are the things that you are specifically struggling with? Because I think a lot of us who had kids and then were diagnosed feel like something's wrong with us. I wasn't fit to be a parent. I have some gene missing. Like I thought this was going to be great and it's hard.
That's so sad. But yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And I think some of that stems from us kind of flying under the radar for so many years. And then we start to internalize and like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm not smart enough. I'm not talented enough. I don't have the motherly whatever. And so there's a whole bunch of like shame and guilt that goes into that, which is even exacerbated after giving birth. And, you know, you already have a difficulty with executive functioning. And then you have to executive function for 2. And sometimes 3, if you're like, if you've got a partner, and just trying to figure out, like all of a sudden you have to do all the planning and all the thinking ahead. And it is exhausting. But just knowing that other people are going through that, you know, we will fly totally under the radar of the postpartum depression screens, right?
Yeah.
Like they're just looking like, do you have birth control? Are you depressed? No. Okay. Have a great life. And it isn't until even after those 6 weeks, at least here in the States, that starts to come into focus.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think that's really true. And I will also say, like, as someone who's had 2 kids and had one like 8 months ago, just the process of having a kid can be incredibly executive functionally challenging because there's a lot of things you have to remember. There's a lot of things you have to prep for. So sometimes I think we focus on post-children for very good reason. That's a huge factor. But especially with my second, I sort of forgot how hard it was to just manage the medical system when you're actually trying to even have a kid. You know, like, what do I bring? What do I buy? When do I do this? When do I do that? Like a lot of that stuff really was a challenge.
Absolutely. And honestly, when I had my son, things were just starting to shut down. And so we didn't get childbirth classes. We didn't get, you know, birth prep. We didn't get a hospital tour. We didn't get any of that. And so honestly, because things hadn't gone virtual yet, my husband and I like YouTubed a birth class, like a birth prep class, because we're like, we have no idea what even to expect. So yeah, like even that thought about like, okay, what can I plan to bring? What do I need to know ahead of time? What can I expect or do I need to ask for afterwards? Like those are huge pieces that, it can be real tricky.
Definitely. And I feel like, especially because, you know, even if you have, and I'm especially lucky to have, and I'm sure you have as well, managed to build a world for yourself, which is quite supportive to your ADHD needs, when you're engaging with a medical system and those kinds of things, it's like taking on a small part-time job. Is the best way I can describe it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That no one thinks that you're taking on, I should add.
Right.
It's like taking on a part-time job that no one realizes is a part-time job, because for them it's just an extra couple of pieces of paper. It's not that big of a deal.
Exactly. And where are you going to put those pieces of paper? And have you filed? Do you have a filing system? And, and then it keeps going.
Are you going to leave them in the doctor's office? I have done that.
Or put them at the bottom of the diaper bag, and like 4 months later, you're like, oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a ton of executive functioning struggles. What does your day look like now? How old is your son now?
He turned 4 in May, so he's freshly 4.
Aww.
He is loving when he's happy and very challenging when he's not. But especially the days that he's home with me, which are 2 days a week, I really need to be planning ahead of time what we're doing. Because if we just sit and flounder, I know I get bored. I think he gets bored. Then we get off kind of a rhythm. And so like tomorrow here in Massachusetts, it's going to be in a heat wave, which I think I looked up. It's like 34 Celsius, I think, for you guys. So
yeah, we're a different place. Yeah.
I know. You're in different seasons completely. But it's like, what am I going to do with my son all day until my husband comes home? And where are we going to go? And it's too hot. So it's like all of these planning ahead things, and now we're potty training. And so we're thinking ahead of like, okay, when does he need to have a pull-up? When do we need to have this? So it's just a lot of thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now. Like even today, like I forgot that it was teddy bear picnic day. So I dropped him off and I was like, oh no. So I drove home, got Panda, came back. So like even those little things like spirit days are like, oof.
Tough. Yeah, it can be really, really rough. And I guess the number one thing I would say to parents who are experiencing this, instead of saying, yes, that's me, if that's you, like we understand. And, it can feel like it's a job because it's a job. Like it's a huge job. And sometimes it's a job that like, yes, you were down for the kid part, like you were like, I want to engage with my son. I want to be present. Like, this is amazing. But you weren't necessarily looking to take on like a part-time job of managing school documentation.
Right. All the mental load stuff. Now he has to have like 3 or 4 clean pairs of shorts to send to school in case he has an accident. So I need to do laundry now twice as often, right? It's just those pieces that you don't even think about when you're getting pregnant and having a newborn. You're like, oh, this is great. And then stuff hits the fan and you're like, oh, okay, this is reality.
But I will say it is doable. You just need to build a system for it. And a flexible structure is often what we talk about. The routines, the systems, and sometimes a little bit of advocacy as well, saying like, hey, like I'm only going to drop this off once a week, because if I drop this off every day, I'm never going to do anything else with my life or whatever it is. Like sometimes you do have to negotiate with the systems that are involved as well.
Absolutely. And I think, having this idea that I think the flexible thinking is really important. I know it's a gift of people with ADHD. I love my husband, but he is not a flexible thinker. And so it's been kind of this like dance of like, okay, well, what limits do we set? What boundaries do we set all the time, regardless of how tired our son is or what the day brought? And how much of it is just like, okay, I need to advocate for myself and say, hey, this is what I need. I don't need him to change into a pajama top tonight. If he wants to wear his Paw Patrol shirt to bed, I don't care. Like that's not my hill to die on tonight, right? And so it's being creative, being flexible, right? And just not holding yourself to such high standards every single day. Yeah. So I think there's this thought about like being consistent with your kid and all this other stuff, and kind of the detriment of yourself. Because then you start feeling bad about yourself, bad about your relationships with your kids. Like it's tough.
Yeah, no, for sure. And to sort of switch tack a little bit, we talked about one very hormonal, space if you're a woman, which is obviously giving birth. But we are starting to see some research into how hormonal changes might be affecting ADHD symptoms. And if you're someone out there who experiences hormonal changes, you're probably going, damn right it does.
Right, of course.
It's taken the medical system a little bit of time to catch up. And so we are starting to see that research now where people are going, there might be something going on at the moment. So what is your perspective on this?
I mean, you can't ignore hormones. I mean, that is the difference between males and females. And I want to say that very inclusively. But if you're a cycling human, everything in your body changes, whether it's puberty, whether it's your menstrual cycle, whether it's pregnancy, childbirth, whether it's perimenopause and menopause. Like those are all huge points in time. And those hormonal shifts can exacerbate the symptoms of ADHD.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's specifically estrogen, progesterone, but it's that fluctuation because our brains and bodies work differently in terms of like, oh, well, if you have this state of estrogen, you have fewer dopamine receptors. And so we're like, oh, okay, from a brain chemistry standpoint, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think there are different points. There are more, I'll say more touch points in a cycling person's life to have those exacerbations than people who don't cycle. And so there are more opportunities to kind of come back and look at it again and be like, I was fine 5 years ago. What has happened to me?
Yeah.
Right?
Which can be really scary.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and I've definitely worked with a lot of people for whom they've been like, well, this was working and now I'm here in my life and this isn't working anymore. And so we can be thrown into crisis a little bit more.
Oh, absolutely. Where you felt like you were on kind of an even playing field and then something changes, whether it's in the month or in your lifetime.
Exactly.
And the things that you knew don't work. And so you've got to pivot real quickly and figure out, okay, this is what's happening. How can I best support myself?
Exactly. Do you have any experiences of your own with this sort of shifting?
Yeah. I mean, if I look back at it, I think of puberty and I'm like, oh, well, that's when school got hard. But I thought that was just because I was in middle school and high school and then went to college and that was a thing. It's very easy to explain away. And so after I had my son and all that kind of stuff, it was like, oh, no, this is a thing. And then I'm starting to see it in moms who are starting to be empty nesters. And they're saying, oh, wow, like I have a real hard time going through my house and organizing things or trying to keep on top of things. I didn't used to do that. And I think there's a lot of explaining it away too, of like, oh, you're older. It just happens.
Yeah.
Right. But there's still ways that you can be supported and find strategies. But it's just this change and this cycle being like, of course, everything changes in the body with hormones, the sex hormones specifically. Like, how can we not pay attention to it?
Exactly. And it is interesting, this idea I think is becoming more and more evident, although many of us have been talking about it for a while, is just, some people are not as researched as others. And so when you're looking at things like ADHD, especially which is an under-researched area on its own, you are really operating on the cutting edge of technology and information in terms of what we even know about this stuff.
Exactly. Like the research, I mean, even in general. So like even in my career as a physical therapist and a pelvic physical therapist, people aren't typically doing research on women because, there's the hormonal piece. And so that clouds the picture.
It's too difficult.
Right, exactly. Or there's not enough, drug research money coming in to do that. And so I think there has been very little actual research, some anecdotal evidence. But even now, as women are being the biggest part of the pie being diagnosed, now people are starting to be like, oh, okay, so how can we actually make a scientific research study that will correctly figure this out so that we can help women manage their symptoms, whether it be medication related or not? Because honestly, drug companies fund a lot of research, right? And so if there's not money in it for them, who's doing it?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. That's a good point. I mean, we do research recaps on here and we're often looking and seeing okay, who's funding this? And sometimes, that is definitely the case. It is nice to see there is more research coming out every day in ADHD. That's what we talk about. And so I'm really excited to see, we pulled 2 articles for this conversation and, the articles sort of went it would be great to get more research on this largely.
We don't have enough information to actually be saving anything.
Yeah. So to second that, we would also like more research on that.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I just have a few more questions for you, Anna, just the questions that we ask everyone. Tell me about a professional achievement that you're the most proud of.
I think getting my doctorate. I have never worked so hard for something in my life and not knowing that I had ADHD. And so I feel like if I were to do it all over again, I would do it very differently and put in a lot more building blocks to support me. Because that is something that now, knowing what I know, I'm like, I don't even know how I did that. I did. And then I got to practice as a PT for many years.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of those pieces that is like, in terms of all of the auditory processing, short-term memory, working memory, decisions. Being a PT is making decisions and calling things out and finding patterns. And that was all super challenging for me. So I think out of anything, like that is the hardest I've worked brain-wise in a way that I didn't know I had ADHD.
Yeah, definitely. I understand. I got my master's without knowing I had ADHD. And I think, I took a year off after that. I did something else. I was like, I needed a break.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And on the other side, do you have a professional failure that embarrasses you, and how did you deal with it?
I think in all of my PT career, I was always behind on my notes. And I knew it. But as soon as my manager became aware of it and had to be like, hey, you're behind, you need to catch up. That was always like, oh boy, I'm getting outed. Even though I didn't know why it was hard then, it was still like, oh, I always had this like perfectionist, high standard, high achieving vision of myself. And all of a sudden to be like, you just need to finish a note. Like it's just a few sentences.
Hard things are easy. Easy things are hard. It's so true with ADHD. It's those little things that can drive us nuts. Yeah,
absolutely. And I never want to be a burden on someone like a manager. I never want to be, called out for something that I didn't do because I've worked so hard to do the things that I have been taught to do. So that's been really hard over the years to finally figure that out and be like, oh, okay. So that's why that was so hard for so many years.
Yeah, 100%. And I hear that a lot from people in your kinds of professions, that idea of the notes or the marking or something. It's always those repetitive tasks can be really, really tough. And what is your favorite dopamine activity? What do you do to give yourself a boost?
I garden.
Nice.
Even before this call, I was out in my garden picking peas and digging in the dirt. That is one thing that brings me joy. It brings me into myself, into the present, that isn't spiraling into shame, guilt. What am I doing next? I just know that I'm giving myself 5 minutes to dig in the dirt and then it will keep going. So to me, that's my big thing.
Yeah, definitely. And then last question, if you had an ADHD life motto, what would it be?
Give yourself grace. I was just talking with a client before we came on this podcast, and we had to laugh at ourselves because she had such an ADHD moment, and I shared mine, and we just had to laugh. And we said, you know what? We don't beat ourselves up about it. We say, that's my brain. That's funny and kind of weird. But I'm not shaming myself, guilting myself. I'm not being an inner critic, but just learning to do that. Because I think especially as women, we spend so many years undiagnosed. We think there is a character flaw with us. But knowing that it's just your brain circuitry and being able to say identify it and say, that's funny. Like this last weekend, I was at the beach with my son. And he said, hey, I want to go, down to the sand. I was like, let me find my shoes. My flip-flops were in my hand. And I looked at my husband and I was like, they're in my hand, aren't they? He's like, yeah, they are. So instead of beating myself up about that, we just had to laugh. And so, we're our harshest critic, but I think giving yourself grace and knowing that there's room for an ADHD brain in motherhood, in your life, in everybody's life is incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Awesome. Well, it was really, really wonderful to chat to you today, Anna. Where can everybody find you?
My website is annaburnswellness.com. Same with my Instagram at Anna Burns Wellness. If you're interested in any kind of time management or meal prep help, if you go to annaburnswellness.com/resources, I've got a couple of free guides to help with those two things, which I feel like are huge pieces of a mom's life, is time management and meal planning and executing. So
100%, 100%. Well, wonderful to have you on.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.